I was born a few years after independence. When we were students, as some of you are, our teachers used to tell us that there were developed countries in the world. There were developing countries in the world and there were LDCs, least developed countries. And it would take hundreds of years, it would take generations for a country like India to catch up with the developed countries. That was just the way life was. By the time people of my generation began to grow up, initially as students, we perpetually had a chip on our shoulder whenever we traveled abroad. And I'm not talking about the so-called developed countries in the West. I'm talking even of countries in Southeast Asia. You would have a perpetual chip on the shoulder and we would be defensive because we would ask ourselves, why can't India be like that? It's very easy to forget that we grew up in an era that was an era of shortages. Until a few years ago, we had 2 landlines. Who uses landlines now? No one does. But growing up years, a landline connection was a very difficult connection to get. So once you got a landline connection, you did not let it go. So it took a great deal of effort to convince ourselves it was a mindset issue that look, the landline can be surrendered. In our growing up years or even much later, you're probably vaguely aware that MPs have a discretionary allotment for train tickets, sort of. It's gone for airlines. You're probably not aware that at one point of time, not very long ago, MPs also had a discretionary allotment for HMT watches because they were in scarce supply. So there was a shortage for everything. When I was a student in Delhi for the first time, there was a shortage of milk. We'd get tokens, we'd go to the Delhi milk supply booth to collect milk. Much of this changed or started to change because of what happened in 1991. It started to change. 1991 was about 22 years ago. We are in 2023. We are looking forward to 2047. The Amrit Kal period, we are shaping the trajectory and the development and aspirational goals for India to be a much better country economically and otherwise in 2047. In 1991, had you asked any economist or anyone for that matter, what will India look like in 2023? Whatever predictions they made, about half of them would have gone wrong. Exactly similarly, any predictions that are made about India for 2047, except very broad brush ones which I will talk about, are bound to go wrong. So first let me talk about the trajectory till 2047, and then I will highlight some transitions that I have in mind. I said the specifics will go wrong, but certain broad trends cannot go wrong. All said and done, India is a relatively poor country. One of the indicators for whether a country is rich or poor is what is called per capita income. And India's income is in rupees, so the per capita income is also in rupees. It is the total size of the economy in rupees divided by the population. That is what per capita is. But it is always useful if you are going to make international comparisons to use a common numeraire, a common ruler, a common yardstick against which you can measure different countries. And that common yardstick, because of the importance of the US dollar, happens to be the US dollar. India's per capita income today is 2,300 US dollars or thereabouts. In making dollar comparisons and making rupee dollar comparisons, there are two kinds of comparisons that are possible. One uses the official exchange rates, which is what I have just done. The other one uses what are called purchasing power parity exchange rates, because after all, 80 rupees roughly in India buys much more than $1 will buy in the US. I am talking about the official exchange rates, not the PPP exchange rates. 2,300 US dollars. Is that high or low? I don't know. Many things in life are relative. Is he tall? How do we know? Compared to who? In the area of literature, whenever something clever was said and you don't know who said it, it is invariably ascribed to Oscar Wilde. In the area of economics, whenever something clever is said and you don't know who said it, it is ascribed to Lord Keynes. So apparently once Lord Keynes was asked, "How is your wife?" and he replied, "Compared to whose wife?" In that way, 2,300 US dollars, is it high, low? We don't know. The richest country in the world today has a per capita income of 175,000 US dollars, even more than that. 2,300 US dollars, 175,000 US dollars. When the reform started in 1991, India's per capita income was 310 US dollars. So India is growing. India will continue to grow, but India will continue to be a relatively poor country. Therefore, the aspirations and goals, therefore the government policies must be tailored accordingly. There are plenty of people who have made projections about the size of the Indian economy in 2047. These projections are in dollar terms. When you make a projection in dollar terms, that projection depends on essentially three assumptions. What is the real rate of growth in India? What is the inflation rate? What is the exchange rate? And if you are doing per capita income, what is the assumed population rate of growth? Even if you assume a relatively conservative real rate of growth of something like 7.5%, and given what is happening in the world today, anything more than 7.5% seems somewhat unlikely. If you assume 7.5%, in the year 2047, India will have a per capita income of 10,000 US dollars. Still poor, but a significant jump from 2,300 US dollars. Those of you who remember 1991 and remember the kind of newspaper media coverage India used to get globally before 1991, you will remember, and we as students had this chip on our shoulder, that the coverage of India was limited to Kashmir, later Punjab, yoga and cuisine. That was about it. If you remember 1991, you will recognize the enormous amount of churn that has happened in India, simply as a function of that increase from 310 to 2,300. When it increases from 2,300 to 10,000, the churn it will lead to is something that we cannot even imagine today. Regardless of how you measure poverty, the percentage of population below the poverty line will drop significantly. Regardless of how you measure human development, including the UNDP's Human Development Index, India will move into the high human development category. 10,000 US dollars really technically means India moves into the upper middle income category. Today there is no definition, strictly speaking, for developed. India falls just short of becoming developed. In terms of the size of the economy, I spoke about per capita income. In terms of size of the economy, the size of the economy will be 20 billion US dollars. To state the obvious, it will be the third largest after China and the US. To state the obvious, India will have a far higher degree of political clout resulting from the economic clout. Having said this, let me turn to some transitions that are obvious, but I want to flag them. These transitions have been in the works for some time, but they have received a fillip, they have received a trigger under the present Prime Minister. So these transitions that I am now going to mention are transitions that are a continuation, but they have become sharper since 2014. The first one is a provision of basic necessities. India has roughly 600,000 villages, roughly. About 125,000 villages were already integrated into the mainstream. Another 125,000 villages were marginalized. One of the things that has happened with this Prime Minister since May 2014 is a conscious attempt to deliver basic necessities to geographically disadvantaged regions. I was born in Shillong, in Meghalaya. Now everyone knows it's in Meghalaya. Shillong is there in my passport, so I remember the years when people would ask me, oh, Shillong, where is that? Is that in Sri Lanka? Now everyone knows where Shillong is. I don't know how many of you have travelled to the northeast. If you have travelled to the northeast, you will realize the enormous psychological impact that comes from the statement that I now have a railway station in my state. I now have an airport in my state. Economic connectivity comes, but the physical connectivity itself is extremely, extremely important. What I said is not something that applies only geographically in the sense of the Northeast. I mentioned those villages. There are government dashboards, sewage treatment, toilets, LPG gas, electricity, roads, a whole lot of things under basic necessities. One of the questions to ask is, are people voluntarily poor? No one is voluntarily poor. Everyone wants to improve his or her life, particularly if the person is in working age groups and is not disabled. If the person is unable to improve his or her life, the reason is that person lacks this physical infrastructure, the social infrastructure. The roads, the water, the electricity, the schools, the health, the financial products. And this has been an extremely important transition, that of empowerment. In Delhi, there is a place called Surajkund, which is an ancient kund now dried up. Attributed to Karna. Karna is supposed to have built Surajkund and worshipped Surya there. Just a few months ago, I read somewhere Surajkund had been cleaned up, although there is no water, so I went to see Surajkund. First thing in the morning, there was no one else there. Entry fee 15 rupees. So I fished for my wallet, took out 15 rupees. The guard said, cash nahi le sakte. So I said, okay, cash has been prohibited. Produced my credit card. So guard said, वो machine खराब है, काम नहीं कर रहा है. So I thought, now what? So I was about to say, ठीक है, दोबारा और एक दिन आएंगे. But my driver, who was overhearing this conversation, said, साहब मैं Paytm कर देता हूँ. So he asked the guard, Paytm चलेगा? हाँ, Paytm चलेगा. Paid by Paytm. So the second transition I want to mention is this wonderful transition that has happened because of the public digital infrastructure, the India stack. Some of us intuitively know of it or know of it as Aadhaar, but it is much more than Aadhaar. Digi documents has everything. And you realize this particularly when you travel to the West and you look at things like vaccination certificates or something else, and you realize that we are into completely different worlds. So far as the digital world is concerned, that is a LDC group today. So the second enormous transition that has happened is in digital terms. On the basic necessities part, there are many reasons why India did not suffer that much under COVID. But one of the reasons India did not suffer that much under COVID was because of the provision of basic necessities, because of the portability of benefits which Aadhaar enabled, which the so-called jam trinity of Jan Dhan accounts, Aadhaar and mobile enabled. One of the reasons the UNDP said in its multidimensional poverty index report that a significant number of Indians have dropped below the poverty line is because of this provision of basic necessities. The next transition I want to mention is, even if you ensure these basic necessities, there will be some people who need subsidies. But everyone in the country cannot be deserving of subsidies. So there must be some method of identifying who these beneficiaries of subsidies are. Most people here, or at least some people probably here are aware that whether it is a union government program or whether it is a state level program, the subsidies are now defined typically by the SECC, which is a decentralized census. There are issues of updating. What the SECC has done, it's not a binary that everything will happen overnight. What the SECC has done is it has eliminated a large degree of leakage. You will still hear accounts about fake PDS holders. You will hear accounts about, you will read in the newspapers about fake farmers. Obviously it happens, but it has come down dramatically. The next transition, which people again don't talk about directly, but I want to state it up front, is a cleaning up of the system. At least in Delhi, I do not know about Bangalore. In Delhi, not very long ago, you went to buy a fridge, you went to buy a TV, the shopkeeper would say, "Kacha raseed chahiye." And many people would say, "Kacha raseed de do, mujhe kya farak padta hai." I am not saying the Kacha Raseed phenomenon has gone away completely. But earlier the Kacha Raseed phenomenon was the default template. Now certainly because of GST, people have fallen in line, the customer as well as the shopkeeper. Real estate was another example of that, where in Delhi, 80% used to be black, 70% used to be black, 30%, 20% used to be white. Immediately after demonetization, the black component dropped dramatically. Let me not exaggerate. The black component has inched up again, but not what it was. RERA has cleaned up real estate, although much implementation is left to the states. From one solitary post box in Bara Bazaar in Kolkata, there were 16,000 shell companies which operated. There about 200,000 shell companies have been taken off the books. So there's been a general cleaning up of the system. I have plenty of friends from trade and industry, and trade and industry is not entirely fond of this government. Sometimes the reason they are not fond of this government, sometimes, not always, is because of this process of cleaning up. Again, cleaning up is not an overnight thing, it happens over a period of time. The next transition I want to mention, and I think it is an important one, the Prime Minister in one of his speeches, he talked about Sabka Prayas. Economists use the word governance. A lot of people use the word governance. What is the difference between governance and government? Do the two mean the same thing? If you look at sophisticated definitions of governance that have been evolved by the World Bank, by the OECD, by EU, you will find governance involves a certain element of decision making by citizens. So governance is a broader concept than government. Sabka Prayas is about that. India is not going to become a more developed country. India is not going to become a better governed country simply because of what government does. It's going to become a better country because of what all of us collectively do. Sabka Prayas. If you look at the voluntary giving up of LPG subsidies, that's Sabka Prayas. If you look up the Smart City Mission, that is the Sabka Prayas. If you think of Mission Life, that is Sabka Prayas. If you look at the Swachh Bharat mission, that's Sabka Prayas. In the introduction it was mentioned that I was a chairman of a committee that examined railway reforms. At that time I insisted, 2015, I insisted that all the committee members had to travel by train, not by air. And when we travelled by train, these were not always very fancy trains. On one occasion, my wife and I were on such a train. It was not a very fancy train, and remember this was 2015, so that media does not quote me wrongly, the year is important. The year was 2015. It wasn't a particularly good train. We stopped at a railway station in UP. Please note the year 2015. In the middle of the night. It was 2:15 a.m. in the morning. The train had stopped to allow a Rajdhani train to pass. So he asked the TT, how long is the train going to stop here? He said about 40 minutes. So he said, all right. Got down. Completely deserted railway station platform at 2:15 in the morning. Only one food stall, one of those carts that was open. And my wife and I got down to stretch our legs. Suddenly in front of us I see a tall, burly man, goes to that food stall, buys a packet of chips, eats the chips, and he throws the wrapper on the ground. And I can see my wife advancing towards him. And I'm not very sure what I should do because I cannot disown any association with her. But I didn't want to be too close, so following her. She goes up to him, taps him on the shoulder, says, उठा के वो कचरे के डब्बे में डालिए. He looks down at her, looks up and down at her, picks it up, puts it in that. Then he goes off. Now we go to that owner and we said, UP, middle of the night, ये क्या है? He says this has happened because of the Swachh Bharat mission. इससे पहले नहीं होता. There are a few other transitions that I want to quickly mention because those are work in progress. One of them is India is rapidly urbanizing. Historically, India's rates of urbanization were low. They have picked up. But most of the urbanization that happens in India happens in areas that have governance-wise outgrown the status of being a panchayat but have not yet become a municipality. So you will see that chaotic urbanization in the periphery of a metropolitan area. I am just flagging that as an issue because we have not resolved it yet. The second transition is a double kind of transition within agriculture. The first kind of transition within agriculture is a transition away from producing food crops like rice and wheat to commercialization and diversification. The second kind of transition is employment opportunities in rural areas that are not farm-based. Why is this work in progress? It is work in progress because a lot of people get very agitated about farmers. My question is, who is a farmer? Any definition of farmer, regardless of the state, is contingent on land ownership, often ancestral. If I have not cleaned up the land records, if I have not cleaned up the cadastral surveys, how do I know who is a farmer? You want me to do something about a farmer? Well, please tell me, where are those clean land records, including in the state that gets most upset, namely Punjab. The next transition that I want to mention is a very palpable transition. Indirectly I referred to it, but you can see it happening. It is the improvement in road connectivity. Everywhere, I am not talking about expressways and highways. Wherever you travel in India, in greater or lesser degree, you will see that improvement in road connectivity. And I said this is work in progress because the bit about railway connectivity has not yet happened. I am nearing the end. So what is the most important transition of all? I think the most important transition of all is something that I started off with. When we were growing up, when we were students, right down through the 70s and the 80s, we were perpetually defensive about being Indian. What this Prime Minister and this Prime Minister's policies have done is that now we are proud of being Indians. And this is an extremely important mindset change, because it affects not really how the older generation react, but how the younger generation aspires and endeavors. Because after all, notwithstanding what has happened to life expectancy, most people who are at least in the first row will not be around till 2047. But the rest of you will be there in 2047. That is an India for you to build. Thank you very much.